Hello, welcome to today's lesson of Liam's views on the forest. Today we're going to talk about the circle of death. The circle of death is an idea that coniferous forest, especially if we manage to remove the beginning of the coniferous forest, where you tend to have more deciduous, broad-leaved, herbaceous stuff, creates a situation where you have pretty low biodiversity and pretty high fire hazard. Hence, there's no moose around Prince George right now, or there's a lot less moose than there used to be. There's a lot more smoke. Smoke, there's quite a few studies out now showing smoke and forest fires cause lung cancer, also cause depression, anxiety, stress. So we have this, our forests in the Prince George region, all over BC, as a matter of fact, in most of Canada, they're not giving us the things that we deserve as citizens of Canada. And I would particularly like to thank First Nations for sort of leading the charge in having a moose-friendly forest, because a moose-friendly forest is a forest that's friendly for people too. So let's start with the circle of death. Right now, we have a forest, and it's going to burn, or it's going to get clear-cut. It really doesn't matter if it burns or gets clear-cut. If it's a boreal forest, not very many trees are going to survive that fire. There'll be the odd tree, but not very many. And it's going to basically eliminate all the standing stock of that forest. So right here, 0 years old, we're going to have no standing stock. That forest is going to start to grow, and it's going to slowly add basal area. And basal area is just a fancy forestry term for having more loads per acre, cubic meters per hectare, however you want to look at that. And then basal area will go up for a while, and then it'll come down a little bit, and then it'll reach a steady state. So this is this basal area. I've got 20 years here and 150 years here. We can change that. It doesn't really matter, because different forests are going to have different age categories, but the trajectory is almost always the same. It takes a little while for the trees to start adding volume, and they add volume rapidly. They peak out, which is called culmination of MAI, and then the standing volume goes down. So that's the first thing. Second thing we're going to look at is fire hazard, and surprisingly, fire hazard pretty much tracks that exact same thing, but it probably drops out a little bit earlier, and then it goes down, and then it reaches a steady state. So as those trees grow up and they have less ladder fuels, and they start to self-prune their branches, and some of the trees start to fall out of the system, you have less dense forest, and you have a slightly less fire hazard forest. But let's be honest, in a boreal forest, if it's dry enough, most of our forests will burn. So another thing that foresters rarely think about, but we need to start thinking about, is biodiversity. So biodiversity, what is biodiversity? For the purposes of my green pen here, this is going to be suitable moose habitat. I'm going to use moose as a proxy for biodiversity, because it's hard to wrap your head around biodiversity. There's hundreds of species. There's probably tens of thousands of interactions between those species. But basically, it's easy to count moose pellets and moose. There's moose around, and there's other things around, because moose depend on a variety of species, and so we can sort of use moose as a proxy. It's not perfect, but you know what? What we're doing on the landscape isn't very good. So I think we can improve it significantly without seeking perfection. So biodiversity comes up right away. As soon as we have that burn, this clear cut, it comes up. And then around 20 years, that stand, pine trees start to drop. Biodiversity drops because those pine trees, they start to top out over the under of the stand. So you think about your blueberries and your willows and your red osier dogwoods, and there's hundreds of species in the understory. There's only a few species in the overstory. Particularly when we do forestry management in the Prince George region or anywhere in British Columbia, we're focused on a few species: pine, spruce, Douglas fir. As those trees get crown closure, what's called, is when the needles start to meet the trees above, shade the understory, you lose a lot of biodiversity. And I mean, you can hear this stuff in the spring if you walk through a coniferous plantation that's 35 years old. You don't hear any birds. And when I say you don't hear any birds, I'm not exaggerating. It's quiet. If you walk towards an opening, you can hear the birds, and this is in June. Everybody knows in June is pretty loud in Prince George. You can also not see the moose pellets. It's just that's a pretty slow, quiet forest, and it's a biodiversity desert basically. So it comes up, and then it goes down. And it kind of bottoms at maybe, I don't know, it could bottom at 30 years, it could bottom at 50 years, depends on the site index, which is how fast the trees grow. And then after about, I don't know, 100 years, it starts to come up again. And we have this sort of, this is right here in this square. This is this old growth forest that we want, right? OG. And the thing about old growth forest is that what we really want is we really want big trees, gaps, and high biodiversity in the understory. And it doesn't happen in very many places naturally, because generally speaking, in this area here in the center, a forest fire is going to come along and wipe that out. So I'm calling this area here the circle of death. And I think that most of our drier forests in Prince George, we're talking to the west of Prince George, to the east of Prince George, we have some pretty large amounts of moisture. We can have forests that get old naturally, but if you're in Burns Lake, it's pretty tough to find an area that doesn't burn if it isn't along a river or something. So in this area, the circle of death, we have high fire hazard, we have low biodiversity. It's a big problem. A little pitch for stop the spray. We shouldn't be spraying glyphosate, because basically what we do when we spray glyphosate is we take out this little bump of biodiversity here. And anybody that's hunted moose knows that we want to be hunting moose, about 10 years after clear cut, maybe 5 years, maybe 15 years. And after 30 years, the moose are gone. So when we spray, we go up for a few years and we drop right off, which is an area of biodiversity that we're losing here. We're losing this area here to the spray, right? So this is a big deal. We need to fix that, but we also need to fix this. So what we're gonna do, instead of having the circle of death, is we're gonna take this idea of the circle of death and we're gonna add in some human interference. Now, there's actually pretty good evidence that the circle of death is a fairly new thing in terms of the history of the world. There is pollen deposits in parts of Canada that were not affected by the glaciers, and they're showing that we didn't have the circle of death for about 2.4 million years up until the Holocene. The Holocene is the last 10,000 years, and there's various debates about why we had more open forests with more understory all over Western Canada. My theory is that we had about 50 species of large animals that don't exist anymore, and if you were an animal that ate pine needles and spruce needles, you'd be full all the time. So instead of the circle of death, we're going to have the perpetual circle of life. And so we're going to take our basal area here in the blue, we're going to go up and go up to 30 years, and then we're going to drop it. And this is called a thinning. And then it's going to go up a bit more, and then we're going to drop it. And then we can clear cut it, take out our big trees, or we can leave some of those trees and we can keep on sort of keeping in this wave here. So what's going to happen to our fire hazard? Our fire hazard's going to start really low, and then it's going to go up, and then it's going to drop, and then it's going to go up, and then it's going to drop, and it's going to drop. And as we manage that forest for older and older trees, you can't manage spruce and pine forests for a really long time, because honestly, it's pretty tough to find a 300-year-old pine tree. It's not impossible, but it's pretty tough. What's our biodiversity going to do? Well, at the start of our stand, it's not going to be very high, but within a few years, it's going to be high, and our biodiversity is probably going to end up something like this. And it'll peak out at some point. So this is going to go from the circle of death, and we're going to call it to the cycle of life. Now, the downside to the cycle of life is it requires human intervention to replicate some sort of, how shall I put it, lack of this sort of super dense coniferous forest that has a fire. And I think that the cycle of life is something that we really can look forward to as a way of making British Columbia a better place to live in. Less smoke, more animals. It's better for us to walk through. Also, in order to pay for all this, we need to have somebody take that wood. We say we're running out of fiber. We're actually not running out of fiber. And here's a little interesting anecdote. This is a tree that was cut just past Mud River. And if you can see here, got some pretty big growth rings. So this tree isn't very old. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. 19 years old. We've got just about 7 inches of growth. So this is a tree that grew up after harvesting. Same exact stand of wood. This is a tree that got killed by the pine beetle. And if you see here, we're just about 80 years to get to the same age. Why is that? Probably climate change. Hard to say. I'm not always interested in the why. I'm just interested in the what is and how we can make things better. And how we can make things better is to admit that clear-cut forestry and spraying and brushing are bad ideas for biodiversity. They increase fire hazard. They don't actually increase wood to the mills, because when you lose your wood to fires, you can't put it in the mill. And to say that humans can play a force in nature, we're not good, we're not bad, we're powerful. We've always known that. If we want to have the world that we want to live in, we have to work towards getting that. We have to work together. We have to drop the ideas that money drives everything, or that man is bad and we should leave it all alone, because neither of those things are true, to move into the center. So thank you very much, and that's the circle of death.